Hi, this is Chuck at Lazarus Recovery Podcast, Junction of Faith and Recovery, and this is episode 31, Life in the Spirit Seminar 1. What I'm going to do is I'm going to tell a little bit of a history of my journey into life in the Spirit. This is sort of an introduction to my history / experience of what they would call life in the Spirit. Originally, I got sober in 1974. Did the spiritual AA thing, God as I understood him. And then a redhead come into my life, and she was part of the Jesus movement, and I chased her into a prayer meeting. And the prayer meeting was what they'd call the Cenacle. It was a Catholic Charismatic prayer meeting in Brighton, in Massachusetts. I chased her into that. She was in AA, but she was doing this stuff, and I was completely fascinated by her. Where she went, I went. And, I was spiritually, I was hungry, and I chased her into a prayer meeting, and I was really, really, really impressed with the way it felt. And she was praying, and she prayed that I'd get saved, the saved thing. Born again. That precipitated a couple weeks of very, very difficult, tumultuous, life-changing stuff. I went through what now know as sort of a salvation experience, what they define as that. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that, because there's some, at least from my experience, there's some parameters for that. When you talk about life in the Spirit, it is, you check that box. If you're talking about life in the Spirit, you sort of check the box. And I'll talk a little bit about coming into it, and then also the thing they call the Life in the Spirit Seminar, which was a Catholic thing, but if you look at it, it has sort of the basics, the checklist of things that are important in getting to a place where you're open for receiving the gifts of the Spirit. I've got to talk about the gifts of the Spirit and that whole thing, because people I'm talking to are in faith and recovery. And that's a problem, because that's a wide spectrum. People in recovery are basically God as I understand them, or any morph of that. Church people, they're not all Pentecostal. A lot of them are dead set against Pentecost and operating in Spirit. It's important for me to go through the what I consider, from my experience, is important points, things that I would consider troubleshooting something, and it's not working the way it's supposed to. You go through sort of a checklist. You check the inputs, you check the power supplies, check things. You make sure that the Navy was the gazintas, the inputs were good. Then you check the outputs and see if it's doing what it's supposed to do. In this particular case, a lot of what I'm going to talk about is the gazintas, the inputs, the foundation principles that make it conducive for the Spirit to operate. And that's sort of the way I'm going to do it. I was a technician. That's how I earned my living after the Navy. I was a technician in instrumentation, mostly research instrumentation, but it was gazintas and gazautas. It was, what's wrong, and do I have all the inputs necessary to get the output? And what's wrong? Why aren't I getting the output I want? So this is a little bit, an introduction to life in the Spirit, but it's also like a checklist of, from my experience, what it takes for individuals and groups of individuals to see a move of the Spirit, and what does that look like? My definitions of what it is. So, this is all my idea, not my experience. And it's, I've been sober for 47, 48 years now. And I've been baptized in the Holy Ghost, saved and baptized in the Holy Ghost for 46 of those years. And I've been in Pentecost and evangelical churches all along, in various ones. I've seen a lot, some good, some bad. But that's why I want to talk about it. It's like a troubleshooting chart, so that you're saying, well, I'm in church and it's what's wrong. It's not, and I'm also going to tell you my opinion of what moving in a church, moving in the Spirit is and what it isn't. You got to define what it is and what it isn't, because there's a little bit of stuff that says, oh, we're moving in the Spirit, when actually you're just moving in a bunch of stuff. And I want to talk about that. So, I think a lot of people are going to be upset, but, this is just my experience. Like in AA, it's your experience, strength, and hope. You can't shoot me from just telling you my experience and my opinions about things. And that's what this is going to be. This is my opinions about how the Spirit works. It's 46 years of opinions. That's sort of hard to match. So, and I've been in recovery and I've been sober for 48 years. I'm going to have to break it up in 2 or 3 podcasts. The first part is telling you the story, sort of the pre-story, the foundation story, like they did for Star Wars. They did the originals, and then they did a pre-story, the early story, and they make movies like that. They do the pre-story. Well, this is the pre-story of my life in the Spirit. This is probably starting getting sober and carrying on after sobriety and after a bunch of stuff. And I'm basically going to tell in abbreviated form what my life in the Spirit has been like. To start the ball rolling, like I said, I got sober in 74. At a certain point, about 2 years sober, I ran into, infatuated with this redheaded girl who came to the Brookline Young People's in Brookline in Massachusetts. It was a young people's meeting on Saturday night. Within a couple weeks of getting back into Boston, I was pretty much made that my home meeting, and a step meeting they had on Monday night there, the same church. So that was my home base for a lot of my early sobriety, and I still visit once a year and talk on phone to a friend who got sober about the same time. I consider him my junior, but he got sober like a month and a half, 2 months after I did, so I consider him junior. But we're both 48 years sober, so can't really look down on him too much. But I was madly in love and lust or whatever with this girl. She was ditzy. She was a redhead. She was, at that point, a little discombobulated, but religious. For some reason, that was like catnip to me. I could not resist. She was ditzy. She was a little bit broken, and she was religious. I was completely smitten, and I chased her all over the place. She was a Christian, and that didn't stop me. It just sort of, she started praying for me, and the beginning of this is an important part of it is, and it'll probably be the major part of this podcast, is the foundation of life in the Spirit is a good salvation foundation. Do that, you got to understand what the definition of salvation is, because a lot of people think, well, they just don't know. And I'll just tell you my definitions, the sort of key points of a salvation experience, which was basically what I had. And it was pretty intense because I just seen the original Jesus' Nazareth series, and I was touched and I was moved. But And I thought about it a little bit. I thought, and she was praying for me to get saved. Accepting the story and getting saved, as I learned, were two different things. Listen to the story, say, yeah, okay, great. Jesus lived, he was a good guy, and then he died, and then the story said he rose again. And that was it. That was the whole thing. That was a marvelous drama and everything like that. But and I was moved by the story, by the movie and stuff like that. I sort of realized that Jesus was important. But, I didn't know anything about, it was like, yeah, I believe in the story. And that was like, yeah, that should be it. And some people would say, that's it. That's it. That's all you need. And there's scriptural basis for that. Believe in your heart Jesus Christ was, rose from the dead. You'll be saved. That's not exactly the way it went for me. Yeah, I started to believe and come to a realization that the story in the movie was actually true. That there was a Jesus. He did live a good life, a seamless, perhaps sinless life. And he was convicted and crucified and died. The story went that he was resurrected. So I started to come to a realization that this was not only a really good story, that there's a possibility that it was absolutely true. And that was impactful, and that is a very strong cornerstone of getting saved. I came to believe that he was real, he lived a sinless life, but we not push that too far, but that he was crucified, dead, buried, and resurrected. The bottom line is I came to start to understand, or was impacted by the fact that perhaps that is true, which was very, very revolutionary to me, because I realized that, well, if he died and he rose from the dead, that meant that he was, as I thought back then, oh my goodness, this Jesus is loose. He is not a hysterical dead person. He is a historical live person. And he has a certain amount of cred because he died and resurrected. So that meant that he was alive. What he said about himself, you had to pay attention to. But mostly it was like, oh my God, he's alive. I got to deal with this guy. He has, by resurrecting, he has authority. He has backing. It was like, well, if God raised him from the dead, then he has cred. That I couldn't dismiss the guys. Okay, great. He rose from the dead. Great. Kudos to you. And, good. Let's move on. It was like I all of a sudden came to grips with the fact that this was a guy I had to deal with. This was a guy that I absolutely had to deal with. I couldn't escape the fact that he was somebody I had to pay attention to. Once I got to that point, I was pretty, some people say that's enough for salvation. Just acknowledging that he rose, was dead, buried, resurrected, and you believe in that, and you're saved. There's another piece to it that is, I consider, very important. That you not only believe that he was who he said he was, and that he had the power to resurrect him, and that made him a person to be reckoned with. Confess with your lips Jesus Christ is Lord, and believe in your heart that God raised him to death. Confess with your lips Jesus Christ is Lord. Well, that surprisingly was, okay, great, he rose from the dead, great, awesome. That's impressive. But then the part was confess him as Lord. Well, I could blow that off a little bit, But at that particular time, in that particular place, God was working on me, and the redhead was praying for me, and I didn't have much of it. I had choices, but it was like I was cleanly aware as I went through those days that I believe that he rose from the dead. I believe he was loose. I believe he had authority over stuff, and he was a man to be reckoned with. But the thing that hung me up was, confess with your mouth Jesus Christ is Lord. I could blow it off and say, Lord, Lord, whatever. Yeah, great. In this particular case, the conviction, as we call it, was so strong on me that I realized that was a key point. Am I willing to make him Lord of my life? In other words, am I willing to do and obey what he said? And I was keenly aware, everybody's keenly aware, that being a Christian is not the best thing for your palette of choices about what you do with your life. It restricts a lot. In other words, my freedom to do anything I want to do with whoever I want to do it with, in any way I want to do it, and at whatever cost to the other person, I was going to lose freedom. I was going to lose choice. That's a key part of salvation, is you got to come and sort of die to yourself and die to the choices. You come to Jesus, you're sort of like, you lose a lot of choices. At least you lose them until you decide you want to just blow them off and do that. But I understood at that point that this was choosing to be obedient to this guy that had all authority. It was a 3-day thing. I felt like I was going to die. I was just like, it was warfare. I felt like armies were fighting over me. And finally, I just surrendered. And I say, okay, good. It's like when I signed up for the Navy. Oh, crap, I don't want to do this. Don't have any choices, this and that, and everything like that. There's no place to go. So I had to go and sign. I had to surrender to the facts. This was the same way. I had to surrender to the facts that this was something I had to do. This was something I had no choice to do. It wasn't like, oh, flutter, this is awesome. It was, I'm accepting lordship of somebody that I don't know. Just trusting that he's going to be a decent Lord. And so that was the key part. Those were the key. He lived a sinless life. He died. He was murdered and put in a tomb, dead, and resurrected 3 days later by the power of God. And I remember thinking, I accepted that. And then it was this massive understanding. Oh crap, I'm going to be, I'm screwed. He's loose, and I just have to do this. So that was my salvation experience. And this is Chuck at Lazarus Recovery Podcast, the Junction of Faith and Recovery. And this is episode 31. One of the key things about Born in the Spirit is a legitimate salvation experience. Thank you much. Bye-bye.